Top of the morning to you and a warm welcome to our coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I am Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky calls the bursting of the Kakhovka Dam an environmental bomb of mass destruction. Countries react to Kakhovka Dam burst as the U.S. admits not knowing what happened. Plus, security analysts say expect more attacks on critical infrastructure after Ukraine dam. Many thanks for joining us. President Vladimir Zelensky has described the bursting of the Kakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine yesterday as an environmental bomb of mass destruction and says only liberating the entire country could guarantee against new terrorist acts. President Zelensky, however, added that the destruction of the dam will not stop Ukraine and Ukrainians. The Kremlin blamed Ukraine, saying it was trying to distract from the launch of a major counteroffensive Moscow says is faltering. Some Russian-installed officials say the dam had collapsed on its own. Meanwhile, the United Nations does not have any independent information on how the Ukrainian dam burst. That's according to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who described the incident as another devastating consequence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The UN Security Council is discussing the dam at the request of both Russia and Ukraine. A torrent of water burst through a massive dam on the Dnipro River that separates Russian and Ukrainian forces in southern Ukraine, flooding a swathe of the war zone and forcing villagers to flee. Guterres called it a monumental humanitarian, economic, and ecological catastrophe.
We have all seen the tragic images coming out today of the monumental humanitarian, economic, and ecological catastrophe in the Kherson region of Ukraine. The United Nations has no access to independent information on the circumstances that led to the destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant dam. But one thing is clear. This is another devastating consequence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we are seeing the effects in the city of Kherson, the town of Nova Kakhovka, and 80 other towns and villages along the Dnipro River. Massive flooding, large-scale evacuations, environmental devastation, destruction of newly planted crops. And that is threats to the highly threatened Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest nuclear facility. At least 16,000 people have already fled their homes, lost their homes, with safe and clean drinking water supplies at risk for many thousands more. The United Nations and the humanitarian partners are rushing support in coordination with the government of Ukraine, including drinking water and the water purification tablets and other critical assistance.
Meanwhile, the White House in the United States is also reacting to the Kakhovka Dam destruction, admitting it cannot say conclusively what caused the destruction of a massive dam in Ukraine, but is assessing reports that the blast was caused by Russia, which has been occupying the dam since last year. Now, the U.S. spokesman, John Kirby, said it was clear that the destruction of the dam on the Dnipro River that separates Russian and Ukrainian forces in southern Ukraine had likely caused many deaths and the evacuation of thousands of Ukrainians.
We've been closely monitoring the impacts of that destruction, which has triggered massive flooding in Ukraine and resulted in the evacuation of, at the very least, thousands of Ukrainians. We know there are casualties, including likely many deaths, though these are early reports and we cannot quantify them right now. We've seen the reports that Russia was responsible for the explosion at the dam, which I would remind, Russian forces took over illegally last year and have been occupying since then. We're doing the best we can to assess those reports, and we are working with the Ukrainians to gather more information. But we cannot say conclusively what happened at this point. We will certainly share more information when we can. What is clear, and what we absolutely can say, is that the damage to the Ukrainian people and to the region will be significant. And as I mentioned, the dam also helps power the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant. So, in addition to loss of life and livelihoods, its destruction could very well have a devastating impact on Ukraine's energy security. And it will certainly have an impact on Ukraine's canal system. I think it's too soon to know, to be honest with you. Again, I won't speak to Ukrainian military operations in any way whatsoever. But right now, the immediate focus is rightly on all the Ukrainians whose lives and towns and villages are affected by this flooding and making sure that they have the aid and assistance that they need.
Reactions from Canada now. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says the destruction of the Ukrainian dam was another example of the horrific consequences of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. President Trudeau, speaking to reporters in Ottawa, says the disaster was absolutely devastating for lives and livelihoods across the region. Meanwhile, Lithuania's president is calling the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine a war crime for which Russia must be held accountable. On the sidelines of the summit of NATO's eastern flank countries known collectively as the Bucharest Nine, the president, Gitanas Nausėda, says in his words, "These are war crimes, and I believe that those who allow themselves to do such things will sooner or later sit in the dock with their heads down and take the responsibility that they must take." The Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, members of both the European nation and NATO, share a border with Russia and are amongst its staunchest critics, as well as being amongst the fiercest supporters of Ukraine in both blocs. A security expert is arguing that the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine has improved the defensive position of Russian troops against the much-awaited Ukrainian counter-offensives. The breach of the dam in Ukraine's Kherson region has muddied the picture for the anticipated Ukrainian counter-offensive and threatens an environmental disaster for civilians living in the war zone. Kyiv and Moscow have blamed each other for the collapse of the dam that sent floods gushing towards surrounding towns and farmland.
You can always say, follow the money. So the money is on the side of the Russians right now, because blowing up the dam of Kakhovka creates a very good defending position for Russians who expect offensive activity of Ukrainian army. At least a month, it excludes this area terrain of use of heavy equipment like tanks or APCs or heavy armored vehicles. But at the same time, it covers for Ukrainians safety on this flank, because during expected offensive of Ukrainian army, Russians won't be able to operate on this direction. Also the short-term consequences for the Crimea region, because they were dependent and they are dependent partly of the water supply of this area of Kakhovka water supply. The Russians control I would say, this southern corridor, land corridor between Russia and Crimea region, because they've taken a lot of roads, bridges, so it shouldn't be a problem for them.
Another expert, Marina Miron, a researcher at King's College in London, called it a turning point in the war, but says both sides could see some advantage in blowing up the dam. For Ukraine, the breach might have provided a way of distracting the Russians while Kyiv launches its counteroffensive, according to her.
Kind of marks a turning point in the sense that now that Ukraine has begun its counteroffensive, and it will be remembered most likely was this first kind of intentional, by whatever side, destruction of critical civilian infrastructure, because so far there have been many incidents, but this is a major one. For Russians, the reason to do it would have been to stop the Ukrainian counteroffensive, obviously, and to create a humanitarian situation in Kherson where people need to be evacuated, and to create swamps so the Ukrainians wouldn't be able to use their mechanized infantry, for instance. So that would have been the kind of the idea if the Russians had done it. Now, if the Ukrainian side had done it, it would fit into their strategy of trying to distract the Russians, because what the Ukrainians have been doing, and they've been kind of the Western allies and the media and the politicians have been pushing for the counteroffensive. And so for Ukrainian military leadership, that's a lot of pressure to act under, especially as everybody is discussing the counteroffensive, so they don't have the initiative of surprise. And so what they are trying to do is to see where Russian defenses are at their weakest.
Let's hear from another leading expert on international security who is convinced there will be further attacks like the blast at Kakhovka Dam as Ukraine steps up its counteroffensive. While unable to verify who was responsible for the damage to the dam, Patricia Lewis of the British think tank Chatham House's International Security Program suggested the attack follows a similar pattern of strikes Russian forces have been using on critical infrastructure in Ukraine.
It's really hard to see how there could be a strategic benefit for Ukraine. They've cut off the bridge and the road, and they've created a situation for the long term that if Ukraine were to take back territory, that they would have a problem on their hands. For Russia, you can see the immediate benefit in that you're stopping that connection for Ukrainian forces to get across. And also, I would say that if they're not planning on staying there for the long term, for whatever reason, if they think, for example, that they're not going to win this battle, then they would leave Ukraine with this long-term headache. So I can see that there is more advantage to Russia right now for this. And when you think that Russia has moved weaponry and explosives into the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, they clearly are not putting safety of their own personnel as well as the locals as their top priority. We don't know enough about the Ukrainian counteroffensive plans, and nor should we, because clearly a large part of them is the element of surprise. So I don't think this would have come as a great surprise. Disappointment, yes, but not great surprise to Ukraine that Russia did, if Russia did something like this. They will be doing other similar things as well. And I would say as well that Russia has now in this war committed a large number of attacks against critical infrastructure. Therefore, this seems to be part of a pattern.
Now let's talk to an expert at the Center for Global Studies Strategy in Ukraine, Dr. Olena Sniger. Dr. Sniger speaks to us from Florence in Italy. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you for the invitation and good morning.
A very good morning to you. Before I get to the Kakhovka Dam explosion, you obviously have friends and family and associates in Ukraine. And how are you feeling over 460 days into this war? How are you feeling? What's your sentiment at this juncture?
We all are shocked. Actually, yesterday it was quite emotional day, and still it is very emotional because right now we are realizing the catastrophe, the consequences of the catastrophe for civilians, and the feeling is almost like when I see people deprived of their homes and dead animals. Luckily, no dead people right now, but we don't know actually yet, especially on the occupied territories. There was no evacuation, literally. So seeing it again, it brings me back to the beginning of the war when I was myself in the people crowd trying to escape the occupation, and when I saw also people deprived of their homes. And yeah, it's quite horrible and it's hard, but what we have to continue to work and to fight and to try to stop this aggression. So yeah, it's hard, but we are striving.
That evokes empathy. We really do empathize on this very difficult situation Ukrainians are going through. Now, to the Kakhovka Dam. it's easy to point fingers and say Russia is responsible. After all, with their invasion of Ukraine, they put themselves in that position. However, because Crimea stands to lose a lot from the dam explosion, does that not mean that there should be a time to find out through investigations whether Russia indeed was responsible? That's the position that the United States has taken, that they're not sure, they're not quick to, though they are fierce critics of Russia, they're not quick to say that Russia was responsible. So what's your view? Is there a possibility that neither side was responsible, as some have said, and it was an accident, or is it more sinister?
No, it was not an accident, definitely, because you just have to imagine and have to show your audience the picture of the dam before destruction, and you have to understand and to see the size of this construction. It's a huge engineer construction. It is really, really huge, because Dnieper River is the biggest river in Eastern Europe, and it's the biggest river in Ukraine. And there are several dams on Dnieper, which are very huge and which have been built during Soviet times with the assumption or with like an idea that they can resist the direct missile strike. So it's not easy, it's impossible to destroy this dam with one missile strike, as Russia claims. That there was one missile strike from Ukrainian side and the dam was destroyed. It is not impossible that that was an accident, because, as I said, these dams, right before the war, there was implemented a project of European Commission of hydro monitoring and safety, monitoring of safety of these hydroelectric stations in Ukraine, because these engineer constructions are huge, and you see that now we see that what kind of consequences we can have if one of them is ruined. So everything was fine before the war. So why it should be destroyed by itself right now? The next point, if you look at the picture, just maybe next time, you can show your audience the picture of this dam. There are very huge concrete pillars, and there were destroyed at least 6 of them. And also there was ruined the turbine area. So it could have been done just if someone plants quite a lot of explosive in right places. So it was done on purpose, and we know who did it, because the site who did it controlled it during a long time.
What are the options for the people who are being displaced from that area? Give us an idea of the location of the dam and the people living who are directly affected by the flooding, who have fled. We understand that hundreds of thousands are without drinking water. But more important as well is the fact that people have to leave their homes. Can you give us an idea of the surrounding environment around the Kakhovka Dam and how the people have to be evacuated? Where will they go?
Well, people from right bank of Dnieper River, which is now controlled by Ukrainian forces, are already being evacuated to the territory of Ukraine, to the safe territory of Ukraine. Yesterday, there were already organized evacuation trains from Kherson to Mykolaiv and to other cities in Ukraine. So displaced people are being evacuated to the safe territory of Ukraine. Those people who are on the occupied territory by Russian forces, Ukrainian side unfortunately cannot guarantee or cannot provide them safe evacuation. And as soon as we know from different open sources, media, from videos that people record themselves and put on online, we know that there is no situation, and people survive by themselves. Like everyone saves his own or her own life and life of neighbors. So it's really difficult situation there, unfortunately. And also we just try to imagine now the consequences. It's not only about agriculture and about infrastructure and about energy. It's also about possible diseases, because summer is coming, and south of Ukraine is quite hot region, and this flood, it brings a lot of mud and a lot of it creates conditions for heavy diseases. So this another concern that has to be taken into account.
That's why it's called a humanitarian disaster, and that's why they're calling it that. And remember, now we hear the Ukrainians have said there's a danger that the mines the Russians have placed are being dislodged by the flooding, so people have to be very careful.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. You're right.
Okay, so now, since it is assumed by the Ukrainians that it is Russia, as you have you've just pointed out, this is what is called a false flag operation, where you bomb yourself so that for whatever purpose that is. If you look back as far as 1999, in the bombings in Moscow of the apartment blocks, that was blamed on Chechnya. And it was also said at that time that it was the Russians themselves that bombed those apartment blocks, which led to President Putin's rise to power as a prime minister. Is this something that the Russians are capable of doing at this time? I'm saying this because obviously Crimea is negatively affected by the destruction of the dam, and Crimea is under Russian control.
Yes, you are right with the idea of with the words that Russians used to use this strategy of false flag tactics. And I like that you reminded us how Putin came to power and how he organized the second Chechenian campaign after Russia signed a bilateral treaty with independent Chechnya. They again invaded Chechnya and defeated it, and right now we have what we have. So, but here I don't think really it looks like they just miscalculated here. The main intention of Russians was to stop or to prevent Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson region. At least to block Ukrainian forces there, because there is the direct, like what they were afraid the most of is that Ukrainians can cut the road to Crimea from Ukrainian territory, from Ukrainian land. So they tried to save this entrance from the occupied Ukrainian territory to Crimea, and at least to prevent Ukrainian forces to counteroffense there. But that, of course, won't stop Ukrainian army from counteroffensive, but that will create definitely difficulties. About Crimea and about lack of water for Crimea, actually Russians, as you mentioned, this blowing of houses on multi-story houses in Russia. Russian authorities do not and never cared about citizens. They do not care about citizens in Crimea, about inhabitants in Crimea. They do not care about farmers in Crimea. They just care about their military bases. And for military bases, there is enough of water in Crimea without Northern Crimean Channel. So they just do not care about all those people who live in Crimea and grow up their seeds and plants and etc. They do not need it actually to have to keep Crimea as a military base. So though all those people, like, look at Russia itself. if Russian authorities cared about its own citizens, they would have never started this war, where already so much Russians have died. And yeah, I have nothing to add. Anything else?
Yeah. Finally, Dr. Sniger, why is Ukraine denying being behind the offensives that have occurred along the borders, the incursions in Belgorod and all those areas recently? And they've said that the counteroffensive hasn't really begun. What's your impression of these forces who are said to be Russian but pro-Kiev that are attacking the Russians and have even taken some Russian soldiers hostage?
Well, why Ukraine is denying? Because it's obvious. Russia even didn't declare and doesn't declare the war on Ukraine. So Ukraine cannot declare the war on Russia by itself, because then it will be the violation, and you can just imagine what can then happen, what kind of consequences will happen then on international arena. Still, I would say that nobody knows actually which forces are those. Obviously, these forces are friendly to Ukraine and to Ukrainian army. Obviously, well, for me, it's my own opinion. I do not speak like official authority here. So what I see that these forces are part of Ukrainian, or can be a part of Ukrainian forces that fight with Russian army, but still these forces position themselves as Russian citizens who are in opposition to Putin's regime. So they joined voluntarily Ukrainian army, and they formed their regiments in the Ukrainian army. It is possible because in the Ukrainian army there is also such a formation like International Legion, where citizens of different countries are fighting alongside with Ukrainians against Russians. So probably there was some kind of operation, or there was a kind of coordination, or there was an agreement that Ukrainian army doesn't stop Russian forces to fight on Russian territory. So I see this way, that it's their own initiative, and they're trying to show Russians in Russia that there are some Russian forces who are really in opposition to Putin regime, and that are active and that are doing something to change the situation, so that many Russians can change their opinion if they want and can join these forces, or at least support them. So I think this is the main idea here.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Just before you go, and can you say in Ukrainian, make peace, not war, for our viewers to hear?
Again, can you repeat, because the connection was not very good?
Okay, I wanted you to translate from English into Ukrainian, make peace, not war. And say it. Or stop fighting.
Хай буде мир і не буде війни.
Fantastic. Can you say that in Russian?
I don't want to say it in Russian. They must say it in Russian.
Thank you so much for humoring us in doing that for us. Really appreciate it. Dr. Olena Sniger, expert at the Center for Global Studies in Ukraine, who joined us from Florence in Italy. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you again, and have a good day. Goodbye.
You too. Coming up, International Atomic Energy Agency Chief Rafael Grossi. Welcome back. Russia has taken its aggression against Ukraine to a new level with the destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric dam in the south of Ukraine. These are the words of the EU Commission spokesperson Peter Stano, who was addressing a news conference, adding that the European Union condemns strongly the horrific and barbaric attack.
The destruction of Nova Kakhovka dam brings the targeting of civilian infrastructure and civilians in Ukraine to unprecedented new level. And of course, the European Union condemns strongly this horrific and barbaric attack against such a crucial piece of the infrastructure with terrible humanitarian and environmental consequences. And it's obvious that this is happening in the context of the illegal Russian aggression, within which Putin did not hesitate to employ hunger as a weapon, energy as a weapon. He weaponized winter.
Hundreds of people were evacuated from settlements along the southern stretch of the Ukraine Dnipro River on Tuesday after water burst through the breached dam in Kakhovka, submerging streets and homes further downstream. Residents in Kherson region district carried their pets and personal belongings as they waded through inundated streets and away from their flooded homes. The collapse of the barrier in the southern tip of the vast Kakhovka region reservoir unleashed a torrent of water, adding to misery for thousands of people who've been caught on the front lines of the war between Ukraine and Russia. Looking downstream, Russia controls the left bank of the Dnipro and the dam itself, and Ukraine holds the right bank. UN atomic watchdog IAEA is calling for the pond at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to be spared. According to its chief, Rafael Grossi, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant should have enough water to cool its reactors for some months from a pond located above the reservoir of the nearby dam that has broken. The dam's reservoir provided water used for the essential cooling of the 6 reactors of Europe's biggest nuclear power plant, as well as of spent fuel and emergency diesel generators that have had to be used repeatedly when external power fails.
Our current assessment is that there is no immediate risk to the safety of the plant. We are following this by the minute, as you can imagine. The IAEA staff on the site have been informed that the damage to the Nova Kakhovka dam is currently leading to about 5 centimeters per hour reduction in the height of the reservoir. The team continues to monitor this rate and all other matters on the site. The main line of cooling water is fed from the reservoir and pumped up through channels near the thermal power plant to the site. It is estimated that the water through this route should last for a few days. The rate may reduce as the water lowers. There are a number of alternative sources of water. A main one is the large cooling pond next to the site that by design is kept above the height of the reservoir. As the reactors have been shut down for many months, it is estimated that this pond will be sufficient to provide water for cooling for some months. The agency will confirm this very shortly. It is therefore vital that this cooling pond remains intact. Nothing must be done to potentially undermine its integrity. I call on all sides to ensure nothing is done to undermine that. The consequences may be grave.
We're now pleased to speak with former Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Joe Keshi, who joins us, I believe, from Abuja, the Federal Capital Territory. Good morning, sir. Good to have you with us this morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Let's have your buy-in on this destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. We've heard from Dr. Elena Sniger, who is Ukrainian and has given us reasons why she thinks that the Russians were responsible. But for those who think differently, what is your impression? Are they responsible? Is it worth it for them to do that to their own people who are in Crimea, or who they say are their own people?
Look, from what I have seen and read, if more people think that the Russians did it than, those who think that the Russians did not do it, number one. Number two is the fact that when you look at the history of the Russian performance, particularly in Syria and now in Ukraine, the Russians have this knack of going after critical infrastructure. And I think that the Russian strategy, in this war or when they assisted Syria was to inflict as much pain as possible on the people, believing that when the people suffer so much pain, they'll probably be ready to give up the fight or supporting, the government. In the case of Syria, those opposed to the government. Mm. So that's exactly what they've done and repeated throughout this in the last, over 1 year in Ukraine. They have virtually went after infrastructure. Remember what they did in December? They virtually went after all the power plants. And why did they go after the power plants? Simply for the reason that they felt that during that critical cold period, people might turn against the Ukrainian government, or people might just give up or just lose hope that this is not a war they can win. But it has not happened. Now, if it was the advantage of the Russians to slow down the much talked about, spring surprise or spring, invasion by counterattack by the Ukrainians. Of course, the Russians have every reason to do this. It's a strategy, and they are ready to pay the price for that strategy, in order for them to win the war. So it's very easy. And for the Ukrainians, if it's not going to benefit, look, why would the Ukrainians go and attack a dam that will flood an area they want to use in their counter-attack against the Russians? That doesn't make sense to me. So at the end of the day, the Russians have done this a couple of times. So it's possible they did it again, to slow down the Ukrainian attack.
That was the reason, as you mentioned, Syria, that the assassin who tragically and evilly assassinated the Russian ambassador to Turkey in Ankara, one of the reasons he did so was the attack, Russia's involvement in Syria. So it's not
exactly
President Putin's first rodeo. Yes, he's been involved in a number of conflicts and wars, and obviously thinks he had this in the bag from the beginning. But with this counteroffensive and the attacks by the pro-Russian militia, who they say pro-Ukrainian militia, who they say are of Russian extraction. Ukraine says it's a hybrid war, and they can do that just as Russia did in Chechnya. And do you think it adds another scary dimension of guerrilla-type tactics and guerrilla-type war strategy to break the spirit of the Russian forces from attacking Ukraine?
Look, remember that popular saying, everything is fair in war and love, remember? So whatever the Ukrainians decide to do, whether to use guerrilla, if that will bring them victory, for sure, they have all the right to do that, because they are defending their right to exist. They are defending their sovereignty. They are defending their country. So any strategy they employ at all, for me, to win the war or to protect themselves. Look, until recently, they actually have done nothing inside Russia. They were doing more. It was the Russians who were doing more in the Ukrainian side, than the Ukrainians were doing to the Russians. And also, the Ukrainians have been limited by those who are assisting them. One of the reasons for assisting them was that the West, particularly NATO, keep insisting that whatever we give to you, for example, for a long time until recently that they gave them semi-long, range missiles. The idea was that, yes, we'll provide assistance to you, but we'll only give you what we believe you will need for your own internal defense. We do not want you to shoot across the border into Russia, so that you do not, escalate or expand the war. So if they now decide to use guerrillas, or sympathizers, Russian sympathizers to fight their battle. Of course, it's fair. I mean, look at what they've gone through. If you were in their shoes, I'm sure you do the same thing. Let's face it. And that's what everybody does. Remember, even during our own civil war, did we not use the Russian pilots? We did. So everybody does this. It's nothing new, really,
But therefore, the danger in that is that because hybrid warfare, as they've called it, or guerrilla-type tactics, as it appears to be, doesn't follow conventional warfare rules of engagement. Therefore, it involves assassinations, blowing up of infrastructure in the enemy territory. Isn't there a danger that they'll be guilty of the same crimes that they're accusing Russia of, war crimes?
I've just told you. It is, look, when you are pushed to the wall and you have to survive, when you're on the defensive and you have to do anything to survive, you will adopt any policy to survive. You understand that? So where the Ukrainians are today, they're in a battle for survival. They're in a battle for the soul of their country. Look at the millions of Ukrainians, that are on exile or that are now refugees. So what the government has a responsibility, whatever strategy it will employ to save itself from the Russian onslaught, it's going to employ that tactics. Yes, they might be accused of employing the same tactics, but you cannot have applying even more dangerous tactics, destroying critical infrastructure, destroying hospitals, destroying power, destroying schools. And you say the Ukrainians should be the holy one, the saints, that they should follow the conventional war rules. For goodness sake, nobody in the Ukrainian position will listen to that kind of argument. And that's why I reminded you, all is fair in love and war. So if the Russians are doing horrible things and the Ukrainians believe that they have to do something similar, probably not at this scale. But look, the Ukrainians have not gone into Russia to bomb any critical infrastructure to start with. And they have a lot they can do if they want to, and if they have the capacity to do that. So let's be fair to them on this, to say that, well, look, they're on the defensive, and they have to do whatever they can do to survive. That's what I think.
This sentiment you're expressing is not far from that shared by fierce critics and supporters of Ukraine, who, among some of them, I found a common thread or a common denominator. You will help us with your view if you think this is where I'm going, is something that is possible. I noticed that countries that were occupied by Nazi Germany under the nefarious Adolf Hitler are fierce critics of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, namely France, Lithuania, Norway, Denmark, Poland. These are all countries that were occupied by the Nazis before they were driven out. Now, countries that are farther afield, such as Brazil, such as China, they are towing more the line of mediation. Is it possible that these countries that were closer to the evil suffered in World War II and World War I have a strange feeling of deja vu, and there's a human emotional aspect to it that they say, no, this is not, we're not going to talk about, we don't want another Hitler?
Look, if you have, one of the things I find funny from our own side, particularly when I listen to some Nigerian critics of supporters of Russia, is the fact that I don't think they understand the history of this area well enough. And I don't think that they read some of the statements or speeches by the Russian president before the invasion. As a matter of fact, he declared that Ukraine was part of the fatherland and that they were fighting to reclaim. And by the way, when you go into the history, this is not the first time that these guys are at each other's neck, by the way. History tells us that this has happened a couple of times, and the bitterness and the determination of the Ukrainians you see today to defend themselves goes back into history. The Ukrainians do not want to suffer what they've gone through the Russians before. But even more importantly, on the Russian side, Putin's desire is to recreate the old Soviet Union, for goodness sake. And to do that, he's ready to pay any price, destroy any country just to take over that country and have a larger empire to govern. What is the population of Russia? How large is Russia? It is huge. It is large. It's an important global country. Why do you want to add a territory, an extra territory into your own vast empire? If not just that ambition that, oh, my predecessors made a mistake in allowing the Soviet Union to collapse, and I'm going to rebuild it. Look, the world has gone beyond such thinking. That's the honest truth. Nobody wants to see the creation of the old Soviet Union, and the countries around Russia who are opposed to this invasion, for goodness sake, we must learn to sympathize with their views, because if we're in their position, we will not accept it.
What peace plan, therefore, would you be more akin to supporting? China has a peace plan that they proposed as a country. I don't recall whether it's Hungary or not, but there's a peace plan from Ukraine as well. Obviously, Ukraine is not going to cede any territory to Russia, and they've also said they want Crimea back. And that's why many have described this as a stalemate caught between a rock and a hard place. What would you suggest, because in view of the casualties?
The only peace plan that I believe will work is for the Russians to go back to where we were a year ago. Crimea can be negotiated. That's a different thing, because the Ukrainians have actually lived for years without Crimea. So that can be negotiated. But you cannot honestly occupy a huge chunk of my territory and say to me, come and negotiate. What am I negotiating? What am I negotiating? Accept that the territories you've occupied will now be part of a larger Russia, and then you leave the rest, half of Ukraine goes to Russia and half remains Ukraine. No. Come on, look, let's face it. I keep making that point. Anybody who is in the shoes of the people of Ukraine will insist on a fair deal. And today, the fair deal is not to it's not to give Russia a part of the territory of Ukraine. So let's go back to to what the situation was, to the status quo in 2021 or 22 when this crisis started. Thereafter, Ukraine and other issues can be negotiated. And that's, and that makes it. Now Ukraine can even decide, look, when you go back and look at how the whole thing started, most of the countries that were part and parcel of the old Soviet Union are today members of the EU. Some are actually members of NATO. And those who went to the EU, why did they go to the EU? They looked at the right. They looked at the left in terms of economic development. They did not see significant progress. They looked at the other side and they saw that their life would be better if they joined EU. And they did that deal and joined EU. You cannot expect those who want to grow, who want to survive, to be static or to just come under your control and not much progress is being made and to begin to live in countries that are not too democratic. No. I just think we need to be fair to the people of Ukraine. So any peace negotiation, my position, would be go back to the status quo as it was before the start of the war. Then you cannot negotiate Crimea. You can negotiate entry into NATO. Yes, Ukraine can give up going into NATO. But you cannot stop Ukraine if it wants to go into the EU, because it wants to improve the lives of its people. That is what government is all about, not this kind of crisis that they are going through. Government is all about the welfare and security of the people. And so if the Ukrainians feel that they have to go into EU, for goodness sake, let them go. If you want to negotiate Crimea, fine, negotiate Crimea. If you want to negotiate NATO expansion, negotiate NATO expansion. That's not a big deal for me. But allow Ukrainians to have their territory and peace back.
Thank you, Ambassador Keshi. As it continues to unfold, we pray for a speedy conclusion. Ambassador Joe Keshi, former Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who joined us from Abuja. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
When we return, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky discusses peace moves with papal envoy. Please stay with us.
From the predictable to the unpredictable, news is fast-paced. On The World Today, we bring you stories from far and wide, narrating the intricacies of politics, diplomacy, war, and disasters. Join us as we make sense of it all, with in-depth coverage and analysis from across the globe. The World Today, every weekday at 5:30 p.m.
Welcome back. The United States military showcased a medical exercise at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany as part of one of the largest air drills in NATO history. Simulated medical evacuation flights from Romania arrived at the air base, where personnel on the tarmac ferried dolls, on stretchers into a waiting hospital bus headed for the Landstuhl Army Medical Center. German and Polish forces also took part alongside Romanian colleagues in the simulation, part of the larger Defender 23 exercise. More than 24,000 service members from 20 NATO and partner nations are taking part in the U.S. Army-led exercise, which started in April and continues until June the 23rd.
So these are days that you truly love being in military medicine, and it really is awe-inspiring to be able to work with our colleagues and collaborators. This started off early this morning, getting a flight. You can see the C-130 behind us, and there were a bunch of us on that plane along with our Polish partners. And what we were really able to do is show that capability and capacity we have in the military, not just the U.S. military, especially the Air Force and the Army, but also our coalition and allies and partners. Specifically Germany, along with the Polish military, along with our Romanian partners, were all involved. And it really highlighted our ability to really respond anywhere, anytime, to any crisis, sort of acute or chronic. And it was very exciting. There's fancy equipment where you can get up into the body and stop the bleeding. That didn't exist when I deployed then. The critical care air transport teams and the assets they have are truly amazing. They didn't have those and didn't have the expertise that they have today. So it really is a different battle space.
Finally, President Volodymyr Zelensky discussed Russia's war in Ukraine with a papal envoy on Tuesday and said he'd urged the Holy See to contribute to the implementation of a Ukrainian peace plan. He added that they had discussed humanitarian cooperation in the framework of the Ukrainian peace formula. President Zelensky wrote on the Telegram messaging app after meeting with Italian Cardinal Matteo Zuppi in Kyiv. That's it for our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you for watching. Do have a good day, and please join us again tomorrow.